Hello, class. It's nice to kind of meet everyone virtually through these final posts. My name is Tori, and I'm in my last year as a history major here at UIS. My final project focuses on the role of fashion during social justice movements, specifically relating to women's movements in the United States. There is no denying that the 2020s have been full of collective experiences or memories in the realm of activism, with major mainstream resurgences in the Black Lives Matter movements after a murder of George Floyd in 2020, the women's movements after a fall of Roe v. Wade in 2022, and Palestinian liberation movements after Israel's response to the October 7th attacks. Fashion plays a role in all of these movements today, with catchy t-shirts with the ideologies of specific movements, as well as incorporating cultural wear in order to show solidarity with members of the afflicted groups. With the rise of the Palestinian liberation movement specifically this year, kufiyas are a prime example of a garment spreading awareness and drawing attention to a specific social political issue, in this case the ongoing apartheid perpetuated by Israel onto the Palestinian people. As I had mentioned, the 2020s have spurred a lot of social political movements so far. I partially undertook this project as well because of my own personal interests and experiences participating in marches as well as other activities for different social causes. My specific realm of study within the history field is focused on public history, which means I enjoy spending time with community members and try to keep up to date with local social issues. The history of specific areas can and does directly tie into the present state of those same places, making community activism, conservation, and commemoration all the more necessary. For this project, I focused on two specific eras that go hand in hand with each other. The 1920s, immediately after the first of four total waves of feminism in United States history, and the 1960s through the 1970s, during the rise of the second wave of feminism. These eras have similar ideologies and social goals, but the execution is much different because of changed social climate and different historical context. The 1920s brought the era of prohibition, the flapper, and new definitions of entertainment for the sexes. The 19th Amendment, passed in 1919, brought a new kind of visibility to white women in America, political visibility. This newfound freedom became a desire for more aspects of life for the average woman, especially socially, through drinking clubs, more active forms of leisure, and finally, simple daily acts such as publicly smoking cigarettes. The 1960s and 1970s were an era rife with various social political movements covering several different groups that both excluded and included women. By this era, women had begun to have more representation in the workforce as well as in academic spaces, but everyday issues of sexism, including sexual objectification and discrimination, were common. This era of feminists sought to define themselves as individuals separate from their gender as well as sexuality, and clothing became a perfect instrument to call others to action, educate others about gender issues, and encourage other women to build connections with each other. While brainstorming and before delving deeper into research databases, the big theme I wanted to maintain throughout was the idea that social political movements during the 1920s and the 1960s produced rapidly changing fashion trends in response to changing social political spheres. Fashion can shift norms, redefine binary gender roles, unify individuals as a group, and inspire an individual to take action towards change. While in the beginning stages of this project, I had a hard time narrowing down specific timeframes to cover fashion through social political movements. I had two original questions during the brainstorming process: which periods in U.S. history have inspired me the most, and how has fashion both defined and redefined social barriers in the U.S.? I eventually came to the conclusion of focusing on the 1920s and the women's liberation movement of the 1960s and the 1970s. From there, I focused on how the eras were connected and if fashion could determine future social reforms from those conclusions. While researching, I kept cycling back to the questions I had come up with during the brainstorming process. After reviewing both primary and a majority of secondary sources, I found three commonalities between both women's movements during the 1920s and the 1960s through the 1970s. First, fashion can in fact be a determining factor of social reforms to come. Clothing can help an individual redefine their role in society. And finally, fashion can inspire individuals to ascend to leadership roles as well as challenge conformity. At this point, there is nothing left to do but write. Throughout my project, I regularly added some secondary source material to add historical context to the connections I had made throughout my research between both eras. In this case, mostly for explaining the content, the 1920s is the decade immediately following the first wave of feminism in the United States. This wave's end is marked by the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1919, allowing white women to vote legally throughout the nation. As I had mentioned before, this form of visibility opened an array of possibilities for women outside of the domestic sphere. Women were now daring to cut their hair into short bobs, wear dresses that showed their bare legs below the knee, and enjoy social activities like drinking and smoking casually in public, with both men and women present. By the middle to the end of the decade, feminism is dwindling on the minds of Americans. Instead, the focus of prohibition bootlegging, the economy, and other reforms such as child labor are beginning to reach the mainstream platform. The worsening of both domestic and international politics during the 1930s overall ceases the mainstream women's movement for a couple of decades. The main focus had been to gain visibility in politics as well as some aspects of social life, and once that had been achieved, external factors began to take focus. Interestingly enough, though, other social political movements halted momentum for earlier feminists. The second wave feminists only gained more motivation to activate change from other social movements. The civil rights movement as well as the anti-war movements were both mainstream in one of the most active points of their respective existences. The 1960s was a world of early modern consumerism and mass production, leading to growing dialogues about the sexual objectification of women in popular media and discrimination in general areas of life, such as healthcare, consumerism, social settings, and the workplace. This era of feminists sought to define themselves as individuals as they saw fit, no matter the social, gender, and sexuality boundaries of the time. Women in both of these periods saw fashion as a way of allowing themselves to find their own definitions of reform through the rapidly modernizing world. After winning the right to vote, seemed filled with more and more possibilities by the day. In both of these periods, clothing was used as a tool to spread awareness of social issues, unify together as a group moving towards new reforms, and to provide a form of public representation for feminism in each respective era. Public media of the era regularly updates the public on feminist happenings as well as the comical depictions of radical women. Some proclaim that the world should get used to things such as this, but others report that women's liberation is merely just a phase, like another fashion trend. During protests of each era, both women's movements and movements outside of women's liberation, clothing sometimes looks uniform in a sense of closely matching dresses, tops, and outfit formulas. However, there is some argument of individuality, as some women within both movements also use clothing as a way of defining themselves within the movement, whether it be sexuality, their pride for womanhood, or just pure preference. Specific trends of each era point to each movement subset of goals outside of gender equality. The short hairstyles and more revealing dresses of the 1920s reflected the changing social definitions of womanhood, while the casual, plain clothing of the feminists of the 1960s reflected a desire to be seen outside of their gender or sexuality. The fashions of these eras can also bring a different perspective into the world of understanding the four waves of feminism in U.S. history. Especially during the 20s and the 1960s, consumerism was experiencing a rise alongside these growing movements, causing some of the participants and leaders of these groups to unintentionally become trendsetters in the world of fashion. Overall, this project was a new challenge to take on, but I enjoyed the archival searches and new perspectives I found. Fashion is and remains a major piece of not just women's movements, but arguably most social and political movements across history. The women of the 1920s and 1960s bravely paved the way for equal opportunities between genders when it came between political, economic, and social barriers, but it is imperative to remember the details as well. Through clothing and different garments, generations of women's movements of the past live on today.